I was admitted to treatment kind of 12, 13 years ago, where there wasn't this massive rush on NHS services, where actually the hospital that I was in, there was a point when there was only 2 people living in that hospital and we had so many empty beds. And like nowadays, we would never see that in reality for mental health services. I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is like, don't compare where you're at in your journey, whether you've got support or treatment, to the fact that I got that treatment back then, because everyone needs that treatment and everyone deserves it.
Hello and welcome to the Straight Talking Doctor podcast. My name is Dr. Mark Cox and this is the podcast dedicated to improving your health and happiness. My aim is to demystify the complex world of wellness and mental health through eye-opening conversations with guests from any and every walk of life. No topic is out of bounds, no question too big or too small. As well as discussing my guests' inspiring stories, I want my conversations to fuel you all with useful and actionable tips that you can adopt into your daily lives. In this first series, we shall be taking a journey into mental health, tackling topics such as dealing with trauma and depression, overcoming addiction, and beating cancer not once, but twice. So thank you for joining me on this journey. Please sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy the ride. So Hope is a multi-award-winning international leading advocate for people with eating disorders, as well as an author of 2, soon to be 3 fantastic books. The first 2 are Stand Tall Little Girl and Hope Through Recovery. She's currently on a mission with her very own government campaign, Dump the Scales, which is aimed at changing the way that people receive treatment and support for eating disorders here in the UK. I'm really looking forward to recording this podcast with you today, Hope. It's been a few weeks since we first met, albeit it was virtually after some last-minute changes to the plan at a wellbeing festival in London called Get Ahead. I hosted a panel with Hope and a couple of other guests, and we spoke about eating disorders. And when I listened to Hope give her answers, I was thinking immediately, I've got to get Hope on a podcast to talk about this important topic and bring her side of her story and what she is doing now to as many people as possible. Can you take us a little bit back and reflect on where your relationship with food sort of changed in your earlier life?
Yes, so I think kind of growing up, I'd always struggled a little bit with food. I struggled a lot as a child with knowing how to kind of process my emotions and how to kind of communicate in the right way. I also was often comparing myself to everyone around me. Whether it was my siblings, whether it was friends at school, kind of that pressure from my parents as well was very, very much there throughout my whole childhood from a very early age. But when I was about kind of 12, 13, it was kind of accumulation of that, plus some other kind of issues going on. I was sexually abused. I had quite a dysfunctional family life at that point. And I think added to that, probably the genetics as well behind eating disorders and disordered eating. I started to really struggle with food and became very, very controlling around what I was eating, kind of counting everything out, kind of constantly weighing myself. And I remember kind of looking back, like in my diaries that I used to write religiously, actually, probably for about 10 years of my life. I wrote a diary every day. At the start of every single month, I would always write, this month I'm going to lose weight, this month I'm going to restrict, this month I'm going to do this. And I got it into my head that a way to feel better about life and myself would be to fixate more on my weight. And from doing that, it gave me more of a sense of purpose and value that I hadn't really got from anywhere else. And I started to really rely on that and the feelings it gave me.
Wow. And it's amazing to hear that on reflection, the things that you went through in your early life, you can then put them down to why you developed those sort of habits that you first developed. Do you find that when you speak to other people with eating disorders that's a similar case in a lot of these people?
Yeah, so I think it's about 70% of people who have an eating disorder have been through some trauma-related issue. I think it's important to remember that trauma doesn't have to be, I don't know, like something that we put on a pedestal, like a volcano erupting or some form of abuse. It could be anything. It could be someone walking into you in Sainsbury's during the pandemic and not wearing a mask. Anything like that could give that person some sort of trauma. So we do see a lot of similarities in that sense. But I do also think for a lot of people with eating disorders, what tends to happen is you start to use food as a way to cope with life. It serves a purpose in that moment for that individual. And definitely in a lot of cases, it numbs a lot of the emotion and those feelings that people don't want to feel. I think the really difficult thing nowadays, and I'm only 31, like I'm not even old, but I think when I was growing up, like there wasn't as much of a fixation on food and dieting and weight and fitness and things like that. And I think nowadays we've normalized a lot of really unhealthy relationships with food. So for people who have an unhealthy relationship with food, whether it's a full-blown diagnosed eating disorder or not, we normalize a lot of those behaviors. And so then we start to really kind of second guess really what is actually going on for us. And then we lose sight maybe of actually why something's happened, why something's been caused, everything like that.
I think it's really interesting that you discussed there that it's not necessarily that you have a full eating disorder and there is different levels to an unhealthy relationship with food, and I think we'll go on to classify that a little bit later, but the relationship of that with trauma or emotion is so clear, and I think everyone can resonate with that when you're stressed, a lot of people will turn to emotional eating. And it kind of is really, really interesting to me, at what point does that go from the flip side of just emotional eating to then developing into an eating disorder and seriously unhealthy habits. For you, how did that manifest?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit like chicken and egg with eating disorders, isn't it? Because you kind of start, maybe if you've got anorexia, you start restricting, you start controlling, and then it serves a purpose, so then you rely on that purpose. But then because you're restricting, your brain function starts to change. And so then you maybe start to think less, I don't want to say less rationally, because you are often very coherent and very articulate even when you're really unwell. But your brain chemistry will change. So you will be changing the way that you're thinking, the way that you're processing things. And I know for me, the more I restricted, the more distorted my body image got. And so then I wasn't really sure whether that was the eating disorder that was doing that, or whether it was just that I had bad body image. So I think it's a really interesting one. So I think for me, when it became an issue was when it just started to control every single thing that I was doing. And whilst I wasn't able to accept that I had an eating disorder up until I was admitted to treatment, I definitely had these moments of clarity in that kind of 4-year period before I got admitted, where I really questioned what was going on. And I'd question like why I couldn't eat when everyone else was eating, why I had to exercise a certain amount. And I remember actually going away with my school friends, and we went away after our GCSEs. I think people still do that nowadays, but they done thing when I was doing my GCSEs. And we had this week of kind of eating and drinking and going out. And I couldn't understand how all my friends could just eat and drink what they wanted to when I just couldn't do it. And I remember leaving that kind of week away and kind of getting home and just kind of being in this complete mess in my head. I had this kind of nagging voice in my head telling me that I'd failed, that I shouldn't have been eating that much. And after that week away, it was pretty much before every single evening with my friends, whether it was drinking or going out to restaurants or just going to someone's house, I always had to weigh up, actually, was I going to get really involved and have a really good evening, knowing that, yes, in the short term, it would be great, but in the long term, it was going to make me feel so much worse. And it was always that kind of trying to juggle it, trying to weigh it all out, trying to work it all out. And it got really, really difficult, actually, kind of towards kind of my admission point, because at that point, I was so fixated on what was going on in my head, and so fixated that if I just lost a bit more weight, I'd be fine, that everything would work itself out, that I wasn't really able to kind of adjust and accept that anything was the matter.
I think it could be really useful here at this point to discuss what actually having an eating disorder involves. So how does someone know they have, or someone that they're close to, have an eating disorder?
Yeah, really good question. And I think firstly, like, it's important to remember that it's so unique to the individual. Like, and that's one of the reasons I think why diagnosis can be so difficult at points is I do think that eating disorders are still massively stigmatized. And when we think of eating disorders, we often think of that kind of white, emaciated teenage girl, when actually we know that only 6% of people with an eating disorder ever fall into that underweight category. So whilst we do need to be kind of conscious, there might be some visible signs, whether that's weight loss or weight gain or change in muscular physique. We do know that actually that sometimes won't ever happen. And sometimes when it does happen, it takes such a long time to happen that actually all of those patterns of behavior are really, really ingrained. So I think for me, like the main ones to look out for is if you've got friends who suddenly become really withdrawn or really, really outgoing. So that kind of change in mood is very, very key in eating disorders. You also might have friends who get really distracted around meal times, whether that's kind of in the build up to the meal time, whether that's when you're sitting around at the table eating or afterwards, kind of feeling quite on edge, feeling quite, kind of distracted, not really present, not really able to engage in that conversation. You'll also have friends that maybe are constantly talking about food and calories and exercise and really kind of seeking kind of that reassurance from others about what they're having, whether they're having enough, whether they're not having enough, things like that. And then I think for me, when it really becomes an issue is when it stops them doing stuff. So when they start cancelling on you for going out for dinner in the evening, or when they can't go to a restaurant because they've narrowed down so much of what they're eating that there's nothing on the menu that works for them, or they can't come out because they want to go to the gym or they want to go for another run and that sort of thing. And I think, again, it's with the whole kind of fitness stuff, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because everyone is fixated on that aspect. And so we kind of normalize that change in diet, that change in fitness routine. But actually, sometimes it could be the kind of starting point of something going on for that individual and something not being quite right.
Yeah, and how often, especially in this day and age with what we see on social media, the health and wellness space and this push for fitness, how often could it be that then leads into more unhealthy habits? It's got, it must happen to a hell of a lot of people. And I think you've probably had experience of that sort of thing and people coming out and telling you about that sort of thing as well.
I think that's the thing. It's so normalized nowadays that we've, in essence, kind of normalized eating disorder culture when you're like, actually, this is just not okay. And it's interesting when I go and I do a lot of work in schools, and I quite often get kind of young people to think about where they would sit on that kind of continuum of eating disorders. And often people will fall into like that kind of middle bracket where they do fast a lot, where they exercise a lot, where they take laxatives, or they purge. And to them, because they do it kind of sporadically, it's okay. And I'm like, that is not okay.
It's like a cyclical thing for people, isn't it? They go through phases of being more or less strict, and it's completely normalized. I know tons of people who literally will go long periods without eating, and it's where do you draw the line on that, and where does that then become extremely unhealthy for them? We touched a little bit before on eating disorder versus disordered eating. So this is again a little bit of a hard one to answer, but what is the difference?
So this is a hard question. So the difference, I guess, firstly, to onset it, I would say any sort of disordered eating is not okay. I think, like we said, we normalize that in society, and it's not right. For me, the difference is when it crosses over into something that starts to control that person's life, where they do not see a way out of it, where they use those food behaviors and exercise and weight behaviors as a way to manage those emotions and to switch off from actually what is going on around them. And because they've got all of that stuff going on with the food, it then takes them out of actually the reality of kind of what is going on around them and stops them engaging in everyday actions. But I do, like I said, and I feel like I could say this just ever, is I do think that if you do sit anywhere on that spectrum, and if anyone listening to this is sitting on that spectrum at any point, like actually that's when you probably should try and start to have a conversation with someone or flag those concerns that something isn't quite right.
Let's go back to your journey a little bit more, Hope. So your battle with anorexia went on for a number of years, and you even said before that you were in denial until you went into treatment. But can you just take us through a little bit more of a timeline of what happened with you, and how then did you achieve recovery? How did things get better for you?
Yeah, so I developed it when I was about 12, 13, and hid it from everyone around me. So eating disorders are really, really secretive illnesses, and you pretty much do what you can to hide what is happening internally. Kind of hid that, became very good at that, lied a lot, kind of did everything I could to just be doing what that voice in my head told me to do. I think my first kind of start to recovery happened when I was admitted to hospital. So I'd had kind of this 6 months in outpatients where I denied a lot, like wasn't really able to accept that something was going on for me. And then eventually was admitted to treatment and lived as an inpatient for about a year. And again, I think just kind of as that reminder to anyone who's listening to this, like I was admitted to treatment kind of 12, 13 years ago, where there wasn't this massive rush on NHS services, where actually the hospital that I was in, there was a point when there was only 2 people living in that hospital and we had so many empty beds. And like nowadays, we would never see that in reality for mental health services.
Never.
So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is like, don't compare where you're at in your journey, whether you've got support or treatment, to the fact that I got that treatment back then, because everyone needs that treatment and everyone deserves it. So yeah, I guess my first lot of recovery really began then. And I did a lot of exercises in hospital. I did a lot of therapy in hospital, and really began to kind of understand initially about kind of what I needed to eat, how I should be eating on a day-to-day basis, and unpacking some of the stuff that had happened to me as a child, realizing that actually I didn't need to have the eating disorder as a coping mechanism, but there were other ways to really live my life. And I think for me, a big thing was actually realizing that whilst the eating disorder made me feel so invincible, actually the reality was it was stopping me living the sort of life that I really wanted to live. And I worked unbelievably hard that year to get to a space where I could be discharged and where I could go straight to uni and start to kind of get my life back on track, I would say. But it was really hard. And I remember leaving hospital and being absolutely terrified, knowing that I didn't want to get unwell again, but not really knowing how to live and not really knowing how to just kind of be okay about food and alcohol. And I spent like my first year and a half or so of uni just so institutionalized. I kind of stuck very religiously to my meal plan that I had in hospital, and kind of ate my meals at the same time, had my snacks at the same time, and really, really struggled with that because I was trying to kind of go out and do things last minute, trying to get really involved. And I was really lucky because my friends at uni didn't question it. They accepted that I had kind of quite random meal times in the day, and they accepted that I really had to have my dinner at 6 o'clock. And if I didn't, there was going to be a panic and I wouldn't be able to cope. But over kind of that time at uni, I gradually began to get a little bit more relaxed about things. It gradually began, I think, to just get my love of life back and start to realize there was so much more to life than the eating disorder and those behaviors. And then I spent probably, like the next 5, 6 years kind of really pushing on in that. I went traveling for a year, and that again kind of helped me get over another plateau. I think so often in recovery from all mental health issues, you hit these plateaus along the way and you get there and you have to kind of reassess where you're at with things. So kind of got over a couple more of those. And when I came back from traveling, I actually thought I was fully recovered. I thought that like I was fine, that life was going to be brilliant and I was never going to be unwell again. But in 2016, I lost my grandma. And kind of going through that whole grieving process and not really talking about things properly, I could feel myself slipping back into those old behaviours. And unfortunately, at that point, did relapse. I didn't relapse badly, which is something that I hate saying. I think a relapse is a relapse. But I didn't get really, I guess what I'm trying to say is I didn't lose a lot of weight at that point. I kind of knew what was happening. I was still able to function at quite a high level, but was able to kind of unpack the frustrations in my head about what was going on, and was able kind of initially within the first 4 months of relapsing to actually be like, right, I need to stop this. I need to go and get some support. And that was when I tried to get treatment and unfortunately couldn't, because I wasn't underweight enough and didn't fit in kind of the BMI criteria to have an eating disorder. And ever since then, I've been in probably an ongoing state of recovery. At that point, I went on antidepressants for about 4 years to try and help kind of clear the fog in my head and to give me a bit more energy. And I've basically just kind of been pushing on since then. I do really, really believe that every single person can make a full recovery from an eating disorder. And I think for me, I'm at like this final few kind of, 5-6%, where I know exactly what is going on in my head. I'm able to call myself out on things. And when I start to feel anxious or get stressed about things, I'm able to be like, actually, why am I feeling like this? What is going on? If my weight fluctuated, I'd be able to ask myself, like, why does it matter? Kind of that sort of stuff. And just, I think, getting to that space where, because of that, I will be able to get that full recovery.
Yeah, that BMI category, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's less than 18.5 is what the NHS suggests is for anorexia nervosa. Is that right?
Yeah, no, it is. And they do say with the new NHS commissioning guidance, which came out in 2019, that we shouldn't be judging someone based on their BMI. But unfortunately, because of funding, because of a lack of understanding around eating disorders, and I think, again, because of the stigma that is so often kind of just there with eating disorders, it means that people are still getting turned away for those reasons.
Yeah, completely. It's really interesting to hear you talk about recovery and that you are still in a state of recovery so far down the line, but you appreciate that because of, I guess, the experiences and in some ways, the training you've had on your own mindset. So you've had this one episode of recovery in the past. Why were you able to spot that earlier to make it, like you say, slightly less of a more serious relapse?
I think I could feel that voice in my head getting louder and louder again. And I've been given a lot of skills when I was first in treatment to help me look out for that. And I think I was able as well to probably ask myself, why am I doing this? What is this going to do? I think so often with relapses, we end up kind of romanticizing the eating disorder and thinking, if I just go back to that, if I just do this, if I just change my behaviors, then back when I did it when I was younger, or back when I did it a couple of years ago, I felt amazing. But actually, I think so often because we do that, we have to be really honest with ourselves. And for me, it was actually realizing that actually, yes, if I focused on the food, it might make me feel better in the short term. But in the long term, I'm not going to have any energy. I'm not going to live the life I want. I'm not going to be able to go traveling. I'm going to end up in a hospital or end up having to have that kind of, I guess, more support. And I think because of that, I could see my life kind of closing in around me. And I was like, I really, really didn't want that. And I think I so often think that with the eating disorder like that, actually, it's like this kind of like bubble thing that's just always there. And at points, it will tell you to restrict again. It will tell you to change your behavior or to do something. And if you listen to it, yes, you might get that short-term relief. And it feels really challenging and really scary to be challenging. But actually, if we're constantly challenging it, it gets easier. And then you start to see kind of all of the rewards for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in these periods of time where you've had recovery and felt healthy, what has kept you in recovery? What sort of things in your life do you do or that are around you that keep you in this state where you're in a good mind frame?
So I think for me, it's always being aware of my motivations for wanting to get well. So when I was in treatment, actually, the first time we did these just so many kind of sheets of paper of motivations, at that point, it was things like I really wanted to go to uni. I wanted to go traveling. Now my motivations are more like I want to travel when we're allowed to do stuff like that again. But traveling's always been a massive kind of motivator for me. And also I really want to have my own family one day. And I think for me at the moment, that's my biggest driver to stay well, because actually if I don't stay well, I won't be able to have my own family. That's just the reality of it. And having those motivations really pushes me forward. And I think as well, I have seen kind of glimpses of that real freedom from actually my eating disorder in the past. And the more I challenge it, the more of those moments I get. And I think most recently as well, what has really helped is unpacking a lot more of the kind of thought process behind it. So I do still see a dietitian. And with my dietitian, we often talk about actually, why would I get in kind of upset if a meal plan changes? And actually an example of this, which I've never actually talked about publicly, it's a very recent example, but just before I got married, we had a 3-day period in the run up to it where my family came to London and we rented a house, and I'd gone through and kind of organized the food and what we were going to do, and was being quite controlling, but everyone kind of accepted it because I was the bride. Even if I think even if I hadn't had an eating disorder, I probably would have been controlling in that situation.
Were you being a bridezilla?
Kind of at points. I'm not proud of some of my behavior. Yeah, I won't talk about that now, but anyway. But the week before, my mum texted me and she changed the plan for the Wednesday evening with the dinner. And I literally was just so angry and so upset about it. And I remember I texted my older sister and was like, I can't believe she'd do that. And Kate came back to me and was like, but why, like, your eating disorder is not about the food. What's actually going on? And I gradually began to unpack it with my sister and was like, I feel like because she's changed the food plan, like it means she doesn't understand what I'm feeling. It means that I don't feel loved. I feel like I've got this kind of abandonment issue. And it turned out that there was all of this other stuff going on, which I knew was always there. But just by, I think for me, having that knowledge through the work that I've done on myself over the last kind of year or so, I was then able to be like, actually, do you know what? Like, I can stop this right now. I can communicate that with my mum if I wanted to, or I can just understand that actually, yes, this has upset me, but it's not about the food. It's a much bigger issue and something else that I probably need to still be working on. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes complete sense to me. I think when you reflect on episodes you have when you're angry, you always can work out, if you trace it back and you really think and you reflect on it, it's not about the guy that pulled out on you on the road. It's what's going on in your life. Like what is the lead up to that stressor? Why did it really annoy you? There's always something. If you argue with your spouse, you go further into it, and if you want to break it down, you will do. You'll find the root cause of that. And I think it's a really difficult thing to do that, especially in the moment. I think virtually impossible sometimes, especially when you're stressed. But it's on a reflective process. When you react and you learn from it later on, when you see the same pattern developing, that's when you can do something about it and you can consciously step in.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's so true. And I think what made it easier in that situation was I wasn't with my mum. So I wasn't able to immediately be like going kind of, just getting really angry. For those people who are listening, that was my angry face that you just all missed. Which probably wasn't really that angry.
It's pretty scary.
But yeah, I think you're right. I think it is it's a work in progress. And I do think that quite often with like triggering situations generally, like you get triggered, then you get this automatic response in your head. And just because you get that automatic response, it's not a weak thing, it's not a failure, but it's like, actually, what can you do? You get that response, then you've got to stop and think, actually, how can I respond in a way that's really working?
Yeah. The brain is trained to do it. The brain is trained to keep you safe. And that's how it thinks it's keeping you safe, by reacting in that way. That's a trained behavior that you've done countless times in the past that has kept you safe. And so it just enacts it very easily again. Just to talk a little bit about the misconception that we talked about, this eating disorders, that everyone with an eating disorder is tiny. A tiny white girl is the way you've described it in the past. So how damaging is this misconception, and what challenges does it pose to people with eating disorders?
Yeah, it's so frustrating. I think that's one of the issues with eating disorders, is we get fixated on these images, and we think, because we get fixated on that image, people don't reach out for support. There's a lot of shame and guilt wrapped up in people who maybe don't have that kind of typical, like what we assume is the look of an eating disorder. But it also means, from, I guess, a wider kind of service provision as well, that actually adult services never really get any funding, because everyone just thinks you can grow out of an eating disorder one day and you'll be fine eventually. But for me, I think it's really interesting because it does stop people reaching out for support. We know nowadays that actually more and more people from marginalised communities, people from different ethnic backgrounds, we know that boys as well are getting eating disorders more and more. But because they're not being represented in the media, because they're not being represented at service level, or even in the way that we're recruiting for kind of the workforce as well, it's still very white. It again means that people are just not going to be able to access that support and not even bothering to try. And I think through the work that I do, I do see this a lot. And it's really, really sad. I think one of my particular passions actually at the moment is for kind of adults with an eating disorder functioning at a really high level, who are never going to really get the support they need because they might not be underweight. But also for adults, obviously, the kind of BMI criteria is slightly stricter because there are less services out there. And the other thing with eating disorders is they're extremely competitive illnesses, and we're constantly kind of in that comparison phase. So as soon as you get told you're not thin enough, or you're not underweight enough, or you don't look like you've got an eating disorder, the eating disorder will go into this kind of minefield in your head, making you kind of feel like a hypocrite, making you feel like you're not good enough. And then in some cases, it will cause that person to completely shut down because they won't want to talk about it.
I've seen people in my own time in general practice who come and they they tell you all about their problem. They're at their most vulnerable when they have a mental health problem, and eating disorders obviously falls into that. And that competitive edge even amplifies this even more, that if you are not able to offer the patient something at that point, I can only imagine the damaging effects that compounds on top of what they're going through. So it must be really difficult. And am I right in thinking you've had personal experience of this when you were younger, facing, when you were trying to receive support yourself?
Yeah, I did. So in 2016, I got told I wasn't fit enough to get treatment. And I did go into this kind of, I had like this 4-week period where I was really, really unhappy all the time, really struggling, was so frustrated at myself, but felt really hypocritical. And I remember sitting in that appointment when I got turned away and just being like, when they weighed me, I was like, I know you're not going to offer me any treatment. I was like, I know how this works. And that, I think, was the most kind of heartbreaking thing, being like, actually, these guys don't really think that anything's the matter with me, because there's someone who's maybe been in for an appointment before me who's much thinner than me. And it was really, really hard. And I did get referred to IAPT, which is the outpatient service for mental health issues, but it didn't really work for me. I did probably 6 sessions of cognitive behavioural therapy, but the therapist, bless her, she did her best, but she didn't really understand eating disorders and what was going on and things like that.
Yeah, they're massively complex. It can be extremely complicated. So you do need a specialist knowledge to really sort of help someone that is going through that. And particularly when you said you were in denial for such a long time, again, how damaging that can be when someone turns to you and says, there's not something wrong with you. Even if they don't mean to, they may not be allowed to offer you something because of the system in place and the guidelines that people have to follow. And that's the difficult thing as well for medical professionals. Then they don't have the ability to do it, particularly in my experience, like I mentioned before, with mental health problems. When there's a huge waiting list and someone is telling you that they are really low or suicidal, and you say, I can only offer you this, it's a self-referral to IAPT, and the waiting list is 8 weeks, or sometimes more, sometimes less. That's a long time, isn't it? And it's it can be a very helpless feeling in that position, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it must be really hard, like obviously for the person and their kind of network around them, but also for the person who's diagnosing, because they'll know that something's probably going on. They'll know that that person needs that support, but they're having to make a decision. And I think when it comes to eating disorders, because it crosses over into the physical aspect as well as the mental aspect, you do have to take into consideration actually how malnourished someone is, whether someone's getting the right kind of food and fueling their body in the right way. So you are going to judge that because you have to. And I think that's why it makes it so, so complicated and still gets us so fixated on that weight aspect. But I do think in those moments, it's sometimes more about the language that's being used. When I relapsed, actually, I had a really bad experience with the clinical team at a hospital in southwest London. But when I went back to my GP to go on antidepressants, my GP said to me, let's see you every couple of weeks. We'll weigh you. We'll have a 10-minute kind of chat about things. We'll do your bloods. And actually, for me, that just felt like I was being a bit heard and a bit more understood, which really, really helped in that moment. So I do think sometimes if we get the language right, if we treat people like humans, like everyone knows we've got issues with workforce and that there's no services available. So it's like, why don't we just tell people, instead of telling them they're not underweight, just be really honest and say there's no beds available, we can't help you. Because I think a lot of people would prefer that honesty.
Yeah, definitely. And for anyone facing this stigma or in a similar position and they're struggling to access the right support or treatment, do you have any specific advice for them?
I think firstly, know that you do deserve that support, and you shouldn't base your own experience of your eating disorder based on the fact that you might not be able to get treatment. I think work out who is in your support network around you. Who do you have that you can have that check-in with, that kind of, I guess, that support around meal times, whether that's distraction, whether that's booking fun things to do after you've had a meal, all of that sort of stuff to keep you going. Make a list of all of your reasons for getting well. I do think that whilst everyone does deserve to have treatment and support, you can recover on your own. I do also believe that. I think it's obviously really, really difficult, but I do think people can do it. So maybe going back to the basics, writing a meal plan, like having some routine, having some structure, and then maybe trying to work out as well, like what are these behaviors trying to tell you? Like, what purpose is it serving? And is it really giving you the outcome of your life that you really want?
And then there are other, I guess, charities and things that we can access as well. I know that one of the ones that you've spoken very highly of in the past is Beat. So Beat Eating Disorders is definitely something that people can access. I guess people in that position, if they're struggling to get any support from the NHS, then try and have a look elsewhere.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, like there's a fantastic organisation called Feast, so FEAST. Who are a carers organisation as well. I think, again, so often, like we do forget about the carers in this. So whether it's a partner, whether it's boyfriends, girlfriends, loved ones, parents, like you name it, anyone can be a carer, can't they? So do as well, if you are looking after someone with an eating disorder, like take some time to look at the resources on our website as well. And I do think like there is some fantastic stuff out there. There's some fantastic blogs, there's some fantastic podcasts people like to look at as well. And I think sometimes that can be the motivation that we need to actually realize there is kind of, I guess, like some goodness on the other side of the fear of the uncertainty of recovery.
Yeah. And I guess if social media comes into it for you, then try and surround your social media time with people that are inspirational or beneficial or not negative, so people that don't make you feel worse about it. Follow Hope Virgo on Instagram. She will certainly provide you with lots of useful resources and tips if you are struggling. We haven't spoken about COVID yet. It's been nearly 40 minutes talking. So let's have a quick touch on the big subject that is the C word. Everyone's mental health, I think, has suffered and has been up and down over the last 18 months. But what has COVID's effect been on eating disorders?
Yeah, so it's been really, really difficult for people with eating disorders. And what we have seen is a huge increase in the number of people who are struggling. We've seen massive increase in hospital admissions, in the number of people on waiting lists, also people being kind of stuck on general wards, with tubes, like you name it. It's just been a really, really horrific year. And I think what was already a really overwhelmed system, COVID has literally just brought the entire kind of service provision for eating disorders to its knees. And I guess a few of the main reasons for that is the kind of sheer uncertainty that everyone's felt this year, but for people with eating disorders, it's that uncertainty and the isolation that the eating disorder really, really thrives off, kind of telling that person, like if they fixate on numbers, if they fixate on food or calories or whatever it might be, that they're going to feel better in the short term. And I think as well, kind of alongside this, we have had some really hit and miss messaging from the government, kind of all the public health campaigns. They've been looking at all of the messaging around obesity. Like it's been really, really difficult for people, I think, to navigate that space. And I think as well, like I would never say that social media causes eating disorders, but the amount people are on social media nowadays, it's not healthy. And we can't ignore that kind of modern society ideals that we see every single day on social media, where people are kind of sharing their kind of highlight reels and sharing how much exercise they're doing. And there was a point in COVID, I don't know if you can remember it, but kind of right at the start of it, where no one could do anything apart from go for one piece of exercise a day and bake. And it meant that every time you went on social media, there was like people baking and there was fitness, and it was just constant. And actually for people with eating disorders, it was quite triggering, kind of seeing all that content all the time. And it did amaze me, like ironically, how the amount of people that I'm friends with who used to be gluten intolerant, and then COVID happened and they started baking banana bread, and I was actually like, this does not make sense. Like it's just odd. But it has been a really challenging year. And I think as well, like what I always say is I would never blame COVID for the increase. Like it's definitely had a role to play, but I do think in certain situations, and actually I was saying to someone today that a lot of people who maybe had an unhealthy relationship with food and exercise had their coping mechanisms in place. Arguably, in some cases, they might not have been very healthy coping mechanisms, but they were in place. And then all of people's coping mechanisms got taken away. So every single one of us was sitting with a lot of uncomfortable emotion that we didn't really want to be feeling. So we were trying to find anything we could to manage that.
Yeah, 100% can completely agree with that. The coping mechanisms all just disappeared for most people, being put into, a confined space, having to work from home, not getting those releases anymore, then of course any of your sort of mental health issues are going to be triggered. You've been preparing a report for the government on the economic impact of eating disorders, and I'm not sure if you've even released too much of that yet. So can you give us a sneak peek of what you've found? What are your findings?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I've been working over the last kind of 3 or 4 months with EY to calculate the kind of cost of eating disorders on the UK economy. So we've looked at kind of carers costs, we've looked at healthcare costs, and we've also looked at kind of the personal costs as well. So looking at things around loss of life, loss of work time. And it's been really interesting, actually. I guess, firstly, it's been quite hard to calculate because we really, really lack a lot of the data around eating disorders. We don't have up-to-date prevalence figures or anything like that. So it's been quite an interesting one in that sense, trying to work out actually how we can calculate this in a way that really, really works. So the kind of key headlines and kind of I guess the main stuff that we found is that in 2019, we've estimated that eating disorders are costing the UK economy about £9 billion a year, which
Wow.
is extortionate. It's ridiculous. And my argument would always be that if we actually invested into treatment properly, then we'd be saving the NHS a lot of money, but we'd also be making more money for the economy because people would be more likely to be able to work and actually get out and do stuff. From a carer's perspective, which might be interesting to some people, it's came in at just about 8.3 billion for 2019, and then kind of went a bit higher up to 8.9 billion in 2020. So again, a massive loss of earnings, massive kind of loss. And I've been speaking to some carers over the last kind of couple of months for the report who have ended up spending kind of, I don't know, between 40,000 and 80,000 pounds on support for their young people. And people have been mortgaging their houses. And that doesn't even take into account those people that are functioning with an eating disorder at a high level, people who maybe aren't even sure they've got one, but who are just kind of struggling with it. Kind of just living with it as if it's normal life. And I think the other thing actually the report has really highlighted from a healthcare perspective is looking at kind of the costs of even dental treatment. In some situations, people with eating disorders get really bad teeth, and people have again been spending thousands of pounds to treat this. And it's this is just so wrong. So what I'm hoping with the report, and within the report, I've kind of written a number of recommendations looking at developing a national strategy for eating disorders, looking at kind of proper ring-fenced funding and investment into treatment, all of that sort of stuff, hoping that actually the report will shine another bit of evidence and another bit of a spotlight onto eating disorders, showing the stark reality of things that are facing people day in, day out, and hopefully will I guess get the government to act a little bit quicker and see this as something that needs to be tackled.
And if you had some of that savings, I mean, I can't imagine a fraction of that 8 billion, you could completely revamp the system that we have in place now. What specifically would need to happen for us to have more support for people with eating disorders in the UK? What would you tell the government to do?
So at the moment, the General Medical Council don't even credential eating disorder training. Which means that actually very few medical people, I don't know the right terminology, you will, go into eating disorder training because it's not seen as something that's worth going into. Also, people with eating disorders get a really, really bad reputation. And when it comes to services, they're often kind of named as being really difficult, not able to deal with or support them. And so again, it's those kind of stigmas that actually we should be changing to help make it a more attractive career path for people. We need to have millions and millions of money going into services so that we can make sure that actually the right treatment is out there. But within that, we also need to have research to treatment. We know statistically that only 30% of people will make a full recovery from an eating disorder, which is just ridiculously low. And a lot of people remain chronically unwell. A lot of people kind of settle and coast along in spaces. And so we need to be making sure that actually services are reformed in such a way that people are getting that right treatment. And I think within that kind of reformation of services, it's about making sure that, yes, you see your GP, yes, you get your bloods done, yes, there's a kind of proper pathway in place. But actually, at the same time as that, everyone who has an eating disorder should have access to a psychologist, to a psychiatrist, to a specialist dietitian, so that they actually can start to really unpack a lot of those behaviors, a lot of that thinking. And I guess as well, like something that I am recommending and something that is really key is working out how we can bring together a lot of this public health messaging. I find it fascinating, and I still haven't worked out why in the UK people's relationship with food is so hit and miss, and like everyone's on a different fatty diet, and you've got bodybuilders, you've got people losing weight. Oh, it's just ridiculous. Like there's just such an extreme scale. But yet in other countries, people seem to just know how to eat. So I think there needs to be a huge amount of work done to bring eating disorders out into the open, to make sure that actually all of that messaging is done in such a way that it's safe, but also helping people.
Yeah. And just to go back to one of your first points there, am I right in saying that eating disorders in general have the highest mortality rate of any mental health condition?
They also have extremely high suicide rates too. So yeah, it's a shocking illness. And the fact that people are still dying in 2021, I was actually saying earlier today that I think one of the reasons the government don't tackle it is because of that stigma, and they still think it's a white teenage girl's illness and people will just grow out of it. And that's why we're getting so stuck in this place where they just don't really fully get it and don't understand the wider impact that it has, not just on the person with the eating disorder, but with like their whole family around them.
And on that fact, no wonder we need a multidisciplinary, more holistic approach rather than just targeting one part. The people who are suffering from eating disorders need support from all angles for them to achieve recovery.
They definitely do. And I think, that's what's frustrating, is it's a very one size fits all, like lack of support approach at the moment, where people get, with anorexia, people get refed and then just discharged. And again, it's not the fault of the NHS. It's the lack of funding. It's the lack of research. It's still probably quite a new illness to some people. So it's getting people to understand all of those bits behind it as well.
Yeah, equipping people with the tools so that they can do it on their own in the outside world, really, isn't it? I like to touch on some bits of advice for all my listeners as much as possible. And we've talked loads about your journey and some of the sort of pressing issues with eating disorders. So let's just go a little bit more into sort of the specifics of what people can use in their lives. So how do people spot the signs of eating disorders, both in themselves or other people?
Yeah, so within yourself, it's a real kind of preoccupation with food and exercise. It's a kind of when you're constantly thinking about food, kind of letting it dominate your day to day, but also when you're starting to navigate your own life and your own experiences based on the food. If you're looking for it in other people, it's looking for that distraction at meal times. It's also looking sometimes at visible signs. So you might get someone who's got quite sunken cheeks. If someone's bulimic, they might go to the bathroom after meal times and come back with quite bloodshot eyes, or with slightly swollen glands, or with sores on their hands. And I think as well, like just when someone does change up their routine and that kind of day-to-day structure and function around the food and the exercise, and the thought of having a rest day from exercise, or the thought of going to dinner last minute causes them so much anxiety that again is a red flag that something's not quite right.
That obsessive nature of it, I guess, is something to look out for, especially when it's affecting someone's life and changing the way that they would usually behave. That change in behaviour, again, that you mentioned earlier on. And then if we spot signs, how do we open up to that person and approach that conversation? This is a question that we were asked at Get Ahead from someone in the crowd, and I've kind of pinched it because I think it's so useful in not just eating disorders, but generally in mental health. You know, today is actually Are You OK Day, so it's quite apt. So how does someone get that conversation started with someone in the right way that's going to get the right response?
Yeah, and it's really hard, I guess, firstly to remember that it's not your responsibility to fix that person. It's not your responsibility to solve what's going on for them. Important to remember the eating disorder isn't about weight. It's not about food, but it's because something else is going on for that person. I am a firm believer in direct conversations. I think bringing stuff out into the open is really, really important. And picking someone up on those behaviors initially to talk about it is key. I think quite often in those situations, the person will shut you down. They'll say they're fine. They'll pretend like everything's okay. And then it's about actually going back to them a couple of weeks later and checking in again with them, like keeping that line of communication kind of open. Maybe if they don't want to talk about the food related kind of habits they've got, maybe talk to them about actually what's going on. Like, why have they lost that love of life? Like, why are they fixating a lot on the food and the exercise? Like, what is it doing for them? And I think, again, just trying to be really patient with it all. It's so difficult. And I can't imagine how hard it is to watch a friend or a loved one really, really struggling when you can see so much that something's going on and they're just not able to accept it. But it is about just being patient, kind of walking alongside them, going out, booking fun activities to do. Like, don't always see the eating disorder when you look at them, but actually realize there's so much more to that person and do what you can to get that part of that person back out.
To anyone out there that is suffering with an eating disorder, do you have any specific advice for them?
Yeah, I think ask yourself, what purpose is the eating disorder serving? Like, try and unpack that, try and unpack what it is about the food, about the weight. If it's a self-worth thing, like, look and see where you can get your self-worth from elsewhere. Like, I actually recently had a friend who sent me a list of 5 reasons she loved me that were nothing to do with my weight or what I looked like. Like, get your friends to do those kind of activities like that. Surround yourself with those types of people, because then I think moving forward, you'll then start to see that actually there's so much more to you than the eating disorder. I also think it's really important to not compare your experience to someone else's. If anything's resonated with anyone today, or if you see something in the news or you think, oh, maybe I've got something going on, maybe something's not quite right with me, use that as a bit of a red flag to actually reach out and start having a conversation with someone. Go to your GP, like, look at stuff online, look at services, and just start to have some of those conversations. Because whilst it's really, really difficult, the only way to really tackle this sort of stuff is to bring it out into the open, and then the eating disorder starts to lose its power and its hold over you because you're communicating it and kind of stepping forward in that way.
The self-worth aspect is really interesting for me. I kind of see mental health as like a triangle of three areas, and self-worth is one that I always put there. So things that feed into how you feel about yourself and how you judge yourself is something that I think is a massive part of how you feel in yourself and what your mental health is like. So it can be anything, you know. Are you achieving your goals with exercise? I guess for some people that would be food. The other 2 areas I like to think of as the other two key pillars are: do you have a sense of purpose? And I think you touched a little bit on that before with when you discussed motivations. So having those motivations to look forward to is really key and keeps that. I think humans, we're innately built to have a sense of purpose, and when we fall away from that, I think our mental health suffers. And then the last one is relationships. And you also touched on that there. So your relationship with yourself, but also your relationship with others. So your relationship with your friend there. So she sent you something, and it's not just the thing she said, but the fact she went and sent that to you is also something that's going to make you feel way better about yourself. And I think when we have healthy relationships, that feeds into mental health.
I think it's that relationship aspects also is just so important, isn't it? Like, surrounding yourself with the right people and having those people that kind of champion you and cheer you on, but also those people that will pick you up on stuff if they're kind of think something's not quite right.
Yeah, and that's why poor mental health is kind of like a catch-22. It's an inverse relationship. When your mental health goes, you tend to stop reaching out to the people who make you feel better. And then you get this sort of cycle sometimes where you feel like you're not as connected to that person, and that feeds into your mental health being not as good as it once was. We've not yet touched on your campaign, so Dump the Scales, something I absolutely love. I urge everyone to go check it out, sign the petition. I think you're on 115,000 when I checked recently. Your target is 150,000 at the moment. Yes, correct. Get in, spot on. But for anyone that's not seen it, I urge them to go check it out. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is, and how it's going, and where you're up to now with it?
Yeah, so Dump the Scales is all about making sure that every single person can access treatment and support, regardless of what their BMI is. And it kind of began as that focus, and began being something that was just about the BMI factor. But over the last kind of 6 months, it's expanded into being something that's about kind of funding, about making sure the right research is there, about this whole kind of complete reformation of services, making sure that actually everyone can have that access and have the right access in an efficient manner as well. So yeah, it's going really well, I think. It's, like you said, got a huge number of signatures at the moment, but obviously always needs more to help kind of get more noise about this sort of stuff, to make sure the government still see it as something that needs to be tackled. It's also been debated in Parliament a number of times. I've taken it to Downing Street, and most recently have been kind of hosting a number of government roundtables where we've been looking predominantly at actually the impact of COVID on eating disorders, and looking at actually how can we develop a strategy around eating disorders with the right funding, with the right service provision, with the right support, so that not only the person with the eating disorder can get the right support, but actually their whole family are treated in the right way as well. So yeah, it's good. I think my frustration with it, and I'm one of these people that wants everything to be done quite quickly, is that I think I can't understand why it's taken the government this long to engage on eating disorders. There's been people who have been campaigning for decades before I started doing this, and it feels sometimes like, do you know what, like it's such a slow process at points that it's hard to feel motivated all the time and hard to keep going with it, I think. And I think that's the same with a lot of campaigning. But I think that's why it's so important that in it, you have to constantly be making noise out there, kind of getting those stories out there, making sure that people are really understanding, actually, this is an issue and this needs to be tackled as a matter of urgency. And at the moment, a huge focus with the campaign is trying to make sure that the government see it as that kind of urgent issue that is an emergency thing that needs to be tackled imminently.
Yeah, well, you're doing a fantastic job on it, so keep it up. Anyone that wants to contact Hope or follow Hope on Instagram, it's just at Hope Virgo, I believe.
Yeah, and do you have a look at the campaign? And I think with it, it's obviously like always looking for more people to sign it and share it, but also kind of looking for people to share their stories and things like that, kind of contacting MPs, because I do really think the only way that we can make this change and get the government to take it seriously is by just talking about this stuff more and more, and making them realise that actually this is something that's affecting every single person in their constituency.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, Hope, absolutely love chatting to you today. I've got one question that I tend to ask everyone. It's general. It doesn't have to be eating disorder specific, but it can be. But what is your one tip for people looking to improve their health and happiness?
Really good question. I've got two. I'm going to go with the first one. The first one, which is it brings in so much into it, so it's good. So is just after Christmas, I created a well-being jar, which was basically a piece of paper which I drew a jar on. I'm sure some people could do these really fancy well-being jars, but mine was just on a piece of paper. And in the well-being jar, I had on it things that I would do every single day for my well-being. So I get up every morning and I do a Bible study, and then I journal every single night before I go to bed. And I probably go outside for at least 10 minutes a day. Particularly when it's sunny, I will make sure that my face is in the sunshine, even if it's a really cold day. I'm like all of that sort of stuff. And then I have like a weekly section where it's like I tend to try and see at least one friend a week. I communicate with at least, 2 people a week, say. I go to church once a week. And then I have like a monthly one, which includes things like, pre-COVID, it would probably include things like traveling, going on holiday once a month. Now it's more kind of general, let's just go for a walk somewhere else in South London or something like that. And then I've also got on the wellbeing jar like an emergency kind of section. So if I'm having a really bad day, my other half has complete free reign to give me a cup of tea, give me my phone and my headphones, and tell me to go and sit outside for 20 minutes. So that's them kind of like my emergency section. And I think for me, like it really helped actually to kind of just rethink where I was at. I think so often with mental health and with well-being generally, like a lot of us really neglect our own self-care, and it gets really easy, doesn't it, to kind of shovel that stuff away and put it off, particularly when work gets busy or when you've got stuff going on or when you've got other things happening. And so for me, having this kind of reminder every single week of what I should be doing, it then meant that definitely at the start of it, I was able to look back at it on a Sunday and be like, actually, what have I done this week from that jar? Nowadays, I don't need to look at it quite as much, but if I'm having a bad time, I might go back to it and be like, actually, this is probably why things are a bit kind of out of key at the moment.
I absolutely love that idea. I think just little quirky things like that, like the well-being jar. I think maybe a few years ago, I just think I don't know what I would think of it. I think now my mind is far more open. And what I've realized, I started journaling as well over the last year or so. When you put your things down on paper, they become a bit more objective, and you can then rationalize them much better in your own mind. And I think that I love the idea of having all the different aspects of the well-being jar. So it's not just your journaling, like you've got all of these different things that you can just look back on, maybe when you're not feeling as good or when you are, and you can then focus on things a little bit more, and you see what things you haven't been looking at quite as much one week. And you think maybe, well, okay, I'm going to see my friends a little bit more, or, I'm going to go sit and get outside a little bit more. I think it's a great idea. I think anyone could adopt that.
And I always know that on the nights that I sleep worse, it's because I haven't journaled. It's probably because I've been just scrolling on my phone, like lying in bed for hours. And I'm like, actually, because I'm now able to see the evidence of that, it also makes it a bit easier to kind of call yourself out on it, I think.
Absolutely. Well, Hope, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sitting down and spending the time to chat with me. I look forward to maybe meeting in person one day rather than over Zoom. But thank you again. Thanks for joining.
No, thanks so much for having me. It was, lovely to talk to you.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Straight Talking Doctor Pod. I hope you not only found this episode interesting, but also hopefully learned something that you can use to help improve your life. If you enjoyed the podcast, or even if you didn't, I'd be so grateful if you could go onto your streaming site and leave a 5-star review so that I can reach as many people as possible. Finally, if you have any feedback or suggestions for further guests, please get in touch with me at The Straight Talking Doctor on Instagram.